Okay.
Quiet.
Last week. Last week we started the book of Kings, and the books of Samuel really deal with the David story. We finished the David story last week, right? Because what happens to David and what we looked at last week? He is dead, okay? And when he dies, he doesn't die in a blaze of glory. He kind of dies in a sort of almost a sad kind of way, that he's this old man who needs somebody close to him to keep him warm, and his family is still going nuts, doing things against one another, and it's still kind of a mess. Behavior has consequences. It just does. But he dies in what we looked at last week, and he kind of passes the story over to whom? Who sort of becomes the focus of the story as we move into
Solomon.
Solomon. Okay, we've got Solomon. And who is Solomon? Okay, Solomon is David's son, but then David has other. Yeah, he has other sons because David has other wives. So he has sons, and Solomon has half brothers. And how does Solomon end up becoming king? What happens that enables Solomon to become king?
His mother goes to David.
Okay, his brother, half brother, is going to take charge. And has already arranged it, in some of David's servants, I'm not saying followers because they're sort of people who work for him, they're supporting him, and that's not a shocker because he's not rebelling, he just is establishing himself as the heir. And Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, goes to David, but she doesn't go on her own initiative. Who kind of initiates Bathsheba going to David? Okay, Nathan. And they devise a plot, and like we talked about last week, it almost sounds like a situation comedy. You tell him this, and then I'm going to burst in the room, and I'm going to tell him the same story, but we're going to act like we hadn't talked about it beforehand. And they convinced David that he made a promise to her that David had never made. That he had promised this, and the combination of the two convinced David that he had just forgotten it. And so Solomon is made king, but this isn't a rebellion against David because David is still there. And so neither Solomon nor his half-brothers seem to be looking to eliminate David. So David is sort of still there, but the authority now rests in Solomon. And David ends up dying. And what does Solomon do now that he is established as king? Now that David is gone, what does Solomon start doing? Or what does he do?
He wants to build a temple.
Well, he's going to build a temple before, and we're going to start talking about that today. Before he does that, because he's king, but David, there's a lot of intrigue in his family. And among other folks, what does Solomon do? He secures his throne, right? And how does he secure his throne? Something that we would think is horrible, but we kind of do it, we just don't.
Having others killed.
Yeah, he starts having people killed. Yeah, and he does it, though, in a way that reflects some justice. But he has the rivals killed. Now, as the writer of the story shapes it, even though he is killing these people, right? What is the impression that we have as he shapes it? I mean, is this a bloodthirsty murder of people?
He's following David's, lack of better words, instructions.
Yeah.
The ones that David said would cause him trouble and they needed to go.
The last instructions David gives is these are folks you're going to have to deal with. And even when he deals with them, he deals with them in a kind of a just way, like Shema, if I'll build your house, but you can't leave it, but if you leave it, you're on your own, and he decides to leave it. So, and his half-brother asking for David's last concubine, which is really a power play. So you can read the story, and the people that end up being killed seem to kind of ask for it, at least as the writer writes it. So it's not like he's just taking and just whacking away at folks. He does it in a way that's more sympathetic, at least in this context. Now, as we read it, it's still, he's killing people. And that makes us uncomfortable in the context in which it's written. To the audience that's receiving it, it may not be viewed that way. It may be viewed as almost a merciful. He's being fair in dealing with this. Okay, which would be a characteristic of a leader, a good king. That he's doing it with fairness. Now, so we've established Solomon is king, David is gone. He's eliminated enemies, or he's eliminated people who may be rivals to him, and so he has established his kingship. And when we get into, start in chapter 3, verse 1, what's the first thing that Solomon does as an established king?
Makes an alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt.
Okay, he makes an alliance with the king of Egypt. And how does he make the alliance? How does he do this?
Marries his daughter.
Okay, Solomon marries Pharaoh's daughter, right? And now, why would that create an alliance between the two countries, between Israel and Egypt? Why would that create an alliance?
Join the family?
Okay, yeah, because
family?
that's the way alliances were built in the ancient world.
Mm-hmm.
You're connecting the lines. So he's making it now. He marries Pharaoh's daughter. What else does the writer in the same story? What else does he talk about? Because I think these two things are linked, but we don't know how yet. He talks about Solomon marrying Pharaoh's daughter as a political alliance between two countries. What else does he talk about in that same section?
About building his temple and building walls around the city.
Okay, he's building a house for himself.
Yeah.
He's building a temple and building walls around the city. What are the people doing?
They were still sacrificing at the high place.
Okay, they're sacrificing, and where are they? And sacrificing. So what are we talking about when
practicing their religion?
Okay, they're practicing their religion. No indication that they're worshiping idols.
Yeah.
But they're practicing their religion. Where are they doing that?
The high places.
They call it on the high places. Now, where would those high places be? For instance, what would be a high place?
Mountain.
Yeah, on a mountain. Now, why would ancient people perform sacrifices on mountains?
They feel closer to God.
Feel closer to God, because if God is up there and they're down here, if you go to a high place, you're closer to God. So they're sacrificing in high places. And why? Why are they sacrificing in these high places?
Because they didn't have a temple.
Because they didn't have a temple. Now, this is kind of interesting because we haven't really heard much about temples, right? Except that David wasn't going to build a house for the Lord. Instead, the Lord was going to build a house for David. The people in Jerusalem already have, what do they have that would give them the ability to sacrifice? What do they already have in Jerusalem? They have the Ark of the Covenant in the tent, right? In which the Ark, so they can. In fact, we'll see later that Solomon sacrifices there, but they're sacrificing also in other places, and it seems as though the writer, and this shows a little shift, The writer seems to be indicating that a temple is something that is now necessary for them. That them sacrificing all over the place, including Solomon doing it, is not necessarily the best thing, that somewhere down the line they needed a temple.
But is Solomon a priest? How can he?
Well, yeah, that's excellent. I don't think he himself is sacrificing. He's sort of authorizing the sacrifice. And one of the things that, and I mentioned it, but that's a great question, because it points to what we're going to see as we get into the books of the Kings. More and more, the king is going to be the focus of everything. Is going to be the focus of the spiritual nature of the people, the condition of the country, even the worship. So when the king isn't, unlike with like Saul, when Saul does sacrifice, that's horrible, because the priest should be doing it. As we get into Kings, the king is going to be more the focus. So when the king is performing sacrifices, the assumption is priests are doing it for him, but the king is the focus. It's the spiritual focus.
And what about when he took the wife from the king of Egypt? She wouldn't have the same religious beliefs
Man, Deb, you are on it today. You are really nailing it, because I think right here, this is a little illusion. This is going to be, we're going to find out that this is going to be a problem. The fact that Solomon takes foreign wives. And even the good kings of Judah and Israel are always going to have issues, which is kind of amazing that they don't write their kings as, sort of superhuman. They're always going to have issues. I mean, David had an issue with Bathsheba, and not turning to God and looking for guidance. Solomon's going to have an issue, and it's going to be centered on foreign wives. Necessary for him to take, because that's how you build alliances. But he's not going to insist that his wives adopt Judaism. He's going to allow his wives to worship
The way they
the
want.
way they want. And he's even going to build them,
Their own.
yes, going to build them their own altars, going to build them their own places of worship. And in fact, he's going to participate in it. And we're going to see later, we're not there at this story yet, that's going to be his flaw. That's what's going to, it's the foreign women he takes because he's king and has so much authority and power. Other countries want to have alliances with him. Therefore, I mean, if he were weak, other kings wouldn't care about having their children marry him because he doesn't have anything to offer. But he does here because God has blessed him, and that's going to be the problem. So you're right. That's what, and I think the writer is sharp enough to know that he's dropping this in, although it's not presented as a problem here. We're going to, later in the story, we're going to say, oh yeah, that's the first thing Solomon did as king. He took an Egyptian wife. All these other wives, including her, will be able to worship as they see fit, and that's going to be the problem for Solomon.
I have to confess, I didn't have that insight. That was a footnote in my Bible.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, I gotta confess.
Oh, well, that was good because I had it as a question. How is this going to be a potential problem? Because that is going to be the problem for Solomon. But we're not there yet. As any good writer, and we saw it with David, we saw it with Saul. Good writers are going to have an arc to their story. So we're not reaching that point where there's a decline. So Solomon is being built up now. He hasn't hit that crisis in his life where he has this decline. Okay, in fact, the writer tells us what about Solomon right at the beginning. Even though he's married this foreign wife and people are worshiping in the high places, what does the writer tell us about Solomon?
He shows his love for the Lord.
Shows his love for the Lord. So, and again, if the writer tells us he's showing his love for the Lord, we believe it. Because that's what the writer wants us to believe. We don't say, well, he's married 4 women here, can't be too loving. Don't, if the writer says he shows love for the Lord,
He shows love for
he
them.
shows love for the Lord. Okay, in fact, he goes to a place called Gibeon, right? To sacrifice, a high place. And that's in the hill country north of Jerusalem. He's gonna sacrifice. And what happens to him as he's about to sacrifice in one of these high places?
The Lord appeared to him.
Okay, the Lord appears to him in a dream. Okay. And what does the Lord ask Solomon?
He told him to ask for whatever you want me to give you.
Okay. And Solomon asked for what? Okay, he asked for wisdom or the ability to discern, be discerning. And why does he want this? Why is Solomon asking
Because he wants to be a
for
good
this?
king, doing it right the way the Lord.
Okay,
would like him to do.
he wants to be a good king, and that's really interesting that's the way you word it. Because for Solomon, what does it mean to be a good king?
He have wisdom to know what's the best thing to do in situations. that
Okay.
come up.
To know right from wrong.
Yeah, to know right from wrong, to know how to respond to situations, to address the needs of the people. All of that makes for a good king, because he could have defined a good king as one that is really powerful, destroys enemies. Good king is a king that acquires enormous amounts of wealth, so those could all be part of his definition of being a good king. But here, he wants to be able to separate, determine, discern good from evil. Now, that kind of that's interesting too, because we've looked at this narrative going all the way back to Genesis, right? And this knowledge of good and evil
Come from a tree.
comes from a tree. Came from a tree. So I think this is an intentional allusion going all the way back to the third chapter of Genesis, where that was the tree, being able to discern good and evil. Now, Solomon asked for this. How does the writer tell us the Lord responds?
In a dream.
Well, it's all happening in dreams.
yeah.
Now, again, and I've said this before, we are not supposed to be in the story. We are looking down at the story. So we know what's going on in Solomon's dream. The people around Solomon, they don't know. But we know because we are part of that. We are experiencing that ourselves. That's the perspective the writer wants us to have. Because the writer then tells us how God, the Lord, feels about Solomon's request. How does he feel?
He's very pleased.
Yeah, he likes it. This is a good thing. So we not only know Solomon's mind, we know God's mind in the way the writer is writing this. And so what does God do?
He'll do what he wants.
Okay, he's going to do what he asks, and
Give them both riches and
it's going to give you, glad you didn't ask for money, glad you didn't ask for power, but I'm going to give it to you anyway, But there's an asterisk at the end of that. What's the asterisk at the end of God saying, I'm going to do for you exactly what you have asked?
Did you follow me?
Okay, if, there's a verse 14. There's a if. You need to walk in my way. You need to follow my commandments and statutes. Statutes like David. Now, again, I think the writer is sharp enough to know that we, the reader, have been through the David story. We've heard the David story. And we know that David didn't always do that. And when he didn't do it, what happened to David?
Trouble.
He got in trouble. He paid consequence. So, we've kind of got it in our mind, yeah, okay. We know about David's story. David did at one point follow the Lord, but when he didn't, he got into big trouble.
Yeah.
Now, what then has God done with Solomon?
Blessed.
Right here. He's gotten, Solomon will get this wisdom that he wants, the discernment that he wants, along with power and wealth. Solomon is expected to walk in the Lord's way, to obey his commandments. What has happened between God and Solomon?
They have a covenant.
We have a covenant. We have a contract. Both sides are contributing something. And what happens when, so we've got a covenant established between God and Solomon. And then what does Solomon do?
Offerings and fellowship.
He offers sacrifices. But he doesn't offer sacrifices in Gibeon. Where does he go and offer sacrifices? He goes to Jerusalem and offers a sacrifice at the ark, in the tent. Okay, which is going to be sort of a precursor, because that's what Solomon's going to be involved in doing. Now, Solomon has asked for wisdom, right? Mm-hmm. Now, the writer then is going to do what? Give us an example of how smart Solomon is, how wise he is in discerning. And good gracious, we've all heard this story before. What's the story?
A child, one dies, one
Yes,
at the same time.
one
died and one stayed alive, and the one took the one that was, or claimed the one that was alive.
Right. You have two women, and the women involved are prostitutes. And they both have babies, right? They both have. Now, they both have sons. Why is this even more important in their situation than it would be like in our world?
Because boys were thought higher.
Oh, absolutely. That's right.
Girls.
That's right. If you could keep them alive until they were old enough, one woman has a protector and a provider. The other woman doesn't. So it's, we think in terms of sort of emotional connection and love and all that. This is, especially since they're presented as prostitutes, they got nothing. These women have nothing. They are on the lowest rung of the social ladder. Having a son gives them the potential of at least having someone feed them. At least have somebody to enable them to grow old, to protect them. Because we've talked about women viewed not having children as a curse, that would exclude. So this is a big deal here, even bigger than we might think. One accidentally kills her baby, goes and switches, and Solomon, of course, says what? Bring the baby here, and I will execute justice by executing the baby. I will cut the baby in half, and you will both get half, and we can go home. And one woman says, oh no, please don't do that, give it to the other woman. And the other woman says,
okay,
seems fair to me. That seems pretty good to me. And that's right. And he says, well, clearly the one who wants to preserve the child must be the mother, so give the baby to him. And the writer tells this little story, and the reaction in verse 28 is, of course,
The people were pleased.
oh, they were pleased. This is Solomon executing judgment, and justice. Okay. So Solomon has received, the writer's telling us, God has made the promise, and boom, this is what it looks like. So we don't need a whole lot more. This is enough. We've established Solomon as wise. Now that's going to be, and I've mentioned it before, that's really going to be important for the Jews, because Solomon is going to be viewed as the one who, anything that is, there's a style of Jewish writing called wisdom literature, and we see that in the Old Testament. Proverbs is wisdom literature. Ecclesiastes is, even Job is considered wisdom literature because it gives us insight. The assumption certainly with Proverbs and Ecclesiastes is because it's wisdom, Solomon must have written it, even though he couldn't have written Ecclesiastes. The language is wrong. The language is Aramaic, which is much later than anything that could have happened here. But that's what they did. They attributed anything wise coming from Solomon. Okay, so that becomes important as the Jews start looking at their leaders and their history. Okay, so execution. Now in the beginning of chapter 4, what does the writer give us?
Same thing.
Officials and-
Yeah, it starts giving us officials, right? And as he gives us these officials, what are they doing? He's got officials. Tell me the nature, because he doesn't list names. He also associates
Describes their duties or.
their duties. So what is the writer giving us here?
government of-
He's giving us the government of Solomon. Now, knowing how precious the papyri he's using is, why would he be giving us these kind of details? What do you think is the purpose, the writer, what's his purpose in giving us these details?
He's well organized.
Okay, that we're talking about a system that is now well organized, right? So we're not talking about just tribes, people wandering around. We're talking about something that is more centralized. So Solomon has more formal authority. One of the interesting things as you look at the list, what's the last of the jobs?
in charge of forced labor.
The charge of forced labor. Now, what would forced labor be?
Slavery.
Yeah, and remember way back
They
when,
warned about that.
yes, Samuel said, understand, one of the things kings do is
Correct, we make you do.
they
for
force
them.
you to work. And, they force you to work. Even good kings do it because they need a job done. And if you're there, they're going to tap you on the shoulder and you're going to have to do it. And again, I don't think this is an accident that in that list, the last one is forced labor. By gum, he is a king. Good king because the people admire his justice. But kings, even good kings, force labor. It's not volunteer. Now, what else does, in verse 7, what does Solomon start doing?
He divided up. Well, he's governor, so he's dividing up his land.
Yeah, he's dividing his land into governors, right? Little territories. What's interesting is, as he's doing this, he's not doing it based on the old tribal divisions. Although there's allusions to the locations, tribal locations, the borders aren't tribal borders. So what is Solomon doing here? He's changing those lines in order to govern. So he is truly functioning as a king, right? This is his land.
So Solomon is just king over Israel
And
and Judah?
Judah.
So are these because it says district governors over all Israel,
Right.
but it's not over Judah.
Judah's separate.
They're still separate, but he's still the king there.
He is still king.
Okay.
He is still king. Now, what's the situation in Judah and Israel? Now, why do you think, going back to this Israel and Judah, why do you think they keep on? Because we've seen this before, that there's always seems to be some kind of a separation between Judah and Israel. I mean, enough, at least enough work to mention. Why do you think the writer continues to do this? If this is now a unified country, and even less than a confederation of tribes, like it's been before, this is really a country. Why would he continue to mention Israel and Judah? Why not just Israel?
Because he had more than that, just Israel, he had ruled the others too.
Okay, well, Judah, though, is a little Judah's not huge. I mean, Israel and Judah aren't of comparable size. Judah is the territory that's associated with Judah is much, much smaller than the territory of Israel. And even population is much smaller. Why would he continue to mention Israel and Judah? What do you think? If you were reading something, why might an author do something like this?
Is it to show unification over his territory?
Okay, pointing towards that there's a unification. Why though would he continue to emphasize this division, that you've got Israel here and Judah here, and they're getting along and they're one country, but I'm still going to mention Israel and Judah.
It must have been a lead into another story.
Okay, I think that's, it's sort of, he's introducing this, and he, not just introducing, because he's been doing it from the very beginning, that this is the destiny. There's going to be a break. Between the two, it isn't here, but there's going to be a break. He's also writing to an audience that sees Israel and Judah as two different countries. They don't see it as one. So if he called it Israel, his audience would say, well, what about Judah? Because for them, Judah is not only a separate country, but is the country, is God's country. Israel is not. Judah is, because it has Jerusalem and the temple and everything else. So I think he's doing that not only to remind us in the story that the two are not going to remain united, but he's doing it in a very practical way to people who associate these two things as separate countries.
Where did they become, I'm trying to think back in history, where did it become Israel and Judah rather than just one?
When did that start?
Yeah.
Well, we've got sort of allusions to it early on. Probably the first one involves Saul, after Saul dies. Ishmael, Saul's son, becomes king over the 10 tribes, and David becomes king over Judah, and it'll be Judah and Simeon, but becomes king over Judah, the two southern tribes, at Hebron, and that's really the first time we've got that kind of dramatic break. Although even earlier in the story, all the way back to Genesis, and we talked about it, we've got some stories, and I'm thinking in the Joseph story, we've got parts of the Joseph story where Judah becomes, like when they're going to kill him, remember, in the colored code, and the brothers decide to kill him, and in one of the strains of the story, Reuben, which is going to be associated with the north, he steps in to sort of say, let's not kill him, let's put him in a hole, and he's going to come back and save him. And then another strain, it's Judah that says, let's not just leave him in a hole, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites so that Joseph isn't killed. So it's that tension between the north and the south even there. With Joseph, Joseph has the two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, and those are northern kingdoms. So the Joseph tribes are in the north, and in the Joseph stories, they become more important than the south. So you have this tension alluded to right early on into Genesis. It really starts taking shape with Saul and Saul's son, because Saul is from Benjamin, and Saul's son, the north versus the south, and then through the David story. Remember, we had that rebellion of the 10 northern tribes with David that David has to put down. So we've got that kind of division here, a sense that you have Judah and you have the northern tribes as being somewhat separate.
So even though Judah is smaller, it still contains more. The 10 tribes went to Judah?
Well, one of the things we're going to see in the story after Solomon is the 10 tribes have more land, obviously, more population. They have better land. Their land is better. They're the hill country, of Ephraim. That's fertile land. They're actually going to be the more politically and militarily powerful country. Israel, the 10 tribes, and Judah's going to be separate and really be weaker. But Judah has 3 things that make them, in this story, in this narrative, better. What are the 3 things that Judah has that will always, in the books of the Kings, will always, and the books of the Chronicles, will make Judah better?
Is it because they have Jerusalem?
They got Jerusalem, 1. Jerusalem's going to be capital of Judah. Samaria is going to eventually be capital of the northern tribes. That's 1. What else do they have?
The order.
They have the ark, and where is the ark going to sit? Eventually. Right now it's in a tent.
Eventually its own
In a
place.
temple.
It's going to be in a temple. Boom. The temple's where? Jerusalem. They've got Jerusalem, they've got the temple and the ark, and they have a Davidic king. And those are going to be 3. And remember, we talked about this earlier. The Jews are going to eventually focus on 3 things that remind them that God is keeping his promises, that God looks after them. They're going to look at land, they're going to look at law, and they're going to look at king. Those are going to be the 3 things. And if you think about what you just said, land sort of symbolized by the city of Jerusalem. Law, a lot of the law has to do with Levitical worship law, not just moral law, but also how do we worship God. The law is going to be connected to the temple. We'll have a connection to the temple. And of course the Davidic king becomes another part of the promise. So the signs of the promise are going to be in Judah, even though Judah is much smaller and less significant than Israel. Even if you look at a map, Judah, it would appear that Judah is going to be less important because Israel is going to be right smack in the middle of any kind of trade routes between Egypt and Mesopotamia. And Mesopotamia is going to have Assyria and Babylon and these other great civilizations. To trade between Egypt and Mesopotamia, you got to go through Israel. So Israel is going to make a lot of money in trade routes. Judah is kind of over to the side. Judah is kind of over to the side. So they're not central to what's going on even politically in the Middle East. Israel is always going to be more important, but not to the writer of the Kings, because 1, he's from the south, and 2nd, he sees these 3 signs of God's promise as being crucial. And Israel can't have any of the 3. Won't have any of the 3, because they won't have the city, they won't have the temple, and they won't have a Davidic king. They'll just be another
Is
country.
that why they fight over the land now?
No. Well, I was going to say no. In a sense, in a secondary sense, yes. And a lot of it has to do with, and this is reflective not only ancient but modern. Populations have shifted a lot in the Middle East, because one of the things that some of the conquerors, the Assyrians and the Babylonians, when they conquered Israel first and then Judah later, is they will move populations. Some of these, they'll move populations around to solidify their power. Well, that's what's happened in the Middle East. That's what happens a lot of places. But that certainly happened in the Middle East. You have a lot of shifts in population. Well, when you have shifts in population, then whose land is it? If the Assyrians move people from Persia into the land to live, is it now their land?
Yes.
Well, they would say, yeah. They don't love it because it's not home, but after 2 or 3 generations, it's the only land they know. And that's what we've seen in the Middle East. And that contributes to the problem. Well, whose land is it? Well, everybody says it's mine. Everybody is saying it's mine, and everybody has a claim to it. And even people that aren't even in the equation, like the Greeks, they have a claim to it because it was their land for a while too. Okay, so we've got Solomon establishing, and what's the situation in Judah and Israel? What's their situation? They're together. Are they prosperous?
Yes.
You better believe they're prosperous. And is Solomon prosperous?
Yes.
Yeah, he is. People are sent, and as the writer writes about this, what is he emphasizing?
Other countries are sending things.
Sending stuff. They're sending stuff. So Solomon and Israel and Judah are acquiring all this wealth. And how is Solomon himself described?
He was happy, and then he...
Well, he's happy, but even more than just being happy. How does God, or how does the writer describe Solomon? Like beginning in verse 29.
He's wise, has wisdom.
He's wise. It's almost like he starts summarizing, right? Solomon is wise. In fact, he is so wise. What is he doing? Solomon is so sharp. What's he doing? What's the extent of his kingdom? His kingdom goes all the way from...
It says he was wiser than any other man, including Ethan, and wiser than all these other people.
He is wiser than anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
He is, in fact, he is so wise. What does he start doing?
Speaking Proverbs.
Yeah, he starts writing proverbs down, and what is a proverb? What's a proverb?
Oh,
Early to bed, early to rise, makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. That's a proverb. That's a proverb. It's just a short little saying that helps you live. And so he's so wise, he's writing it down, but he's not just wise about, practical advice. He knows
everything.
everything.
People from out around came in.
Oh man, because he knows about plants, and he knows about animals, and he knows about reptiles, and he knows about birds, and people are coming and talking to him. And his kingdom extends from the Euphrates to Egypt. This is huge area. And if you look on a map, and your Bible has maps, the extent is to include cities like Damascus, which never is part. That wasn't part of the land God gave to Israel. It's huge. So Solomon is successful, right? He's a good king. But there's one thing Solomon hasn't done yet, right? And we kind of got it alluded to earlier. What hasn't he done yet? He hadn't built a temple, And in chapter 5, who is introduced in chapter 5? Hiram. And where is Hiram? He is Tyre. He is king of Tyre. And where is Tyre?
I don't know.
Good question. Tyre is not a little, it's a huge city on the Mediterranean. It's a port city. In fact, Tyre is kind of an interesting city. It was built on an island offshore. And there was a causeway that connected Tyre to the shore. Now, what would be the advantage of having your city built on a little island?
It's accessible.
You could defend it. Boy, you could defend it. Not only was it good for shipping and it becomes a trading, but you could defend it. Because you knock down that little causeway or defend the causeway, you're going to protect the city. Just like Jerusalem's on a mountain, easier to defend. Being on an island is easier to defend. So Tyre is there right on the coast, Hiram. And that, since it's on the coast, it's a trading city, big city, it's very prosperous. But what does the writer tell us about Hiram? What does he tell us about who this guy is? Because the writer tells us all we need to know about him.
He sent
Been a
envoys
friend of
to
David's.
Solomon.
Okay, he's a buddy of David. You know, he knew his father, Solomon's father. Now, what message does Solomon send to Hiram?
He tells him that he couldn't build the temple before. David couldn't build the temple before, but he's planning to build it.
Okay, David couldn't build the temple before. Now, what reason does Solomon offer in this message he's sending to Hiram? What is the reason why David couldn't build it, but now Solomon can?
Well, it was all the wars.
Okay, because David's kingdom was not stable, they were threatened on all sides, and now Solomon's kingdom is
Better, stronger.
stronger, more secure, safer. Now, is that the reason that we read about in Samuel, 2 Samuel? The reason David didn't build his temple because there were too many enemies around? No, why didn't David build his
God said not
temple?
to.
Because God said not to. Okay. But Solomon is telling Hiram, this is why David didn't build it, but my kingdom is now
Secure.
so secure. It is incredibly secure. So now's the time to build the temple. Now, what does he want from Hiram?
Cedars and cedars from
Send me cedar. Because clearly he wanted to build like armoires and closets and wanted his clothes protected
Smell
from
good.
moths, right?
Yeah.
So that became, if you look at the flag of Lebanon, which is the modern area of Tyre, what's on the flag of Lebanon?
Cedar tree.
It's a tree. It's a cedar tree on the flag of Lebanon. So cedar is a big deal, you know. So he wants, and in fact, even when David built his house, that's where the lumber came to build his house, which was cedar. Built it out of cedar. Okay. That he needs from Hiram cedar. Now, why does he need that? What does he need Hiram to do with this cedar? He wants cedar coming from Hiram, and Hiram is around Lebanon. Why does he need Hiram's help?
Because he needs skilled men to cut down.
Because he needs somebody who knows how to do it. And evidently,
Nobody.
yeah, Jews don't know how to do it. And if you want to cut down a tree, a cedar, who do you get?
Somebody knows what they're doing.
Yeah, know what they're doing. And who knows what they're doing?
Cut down-
Sidonites.
Yeah.
Sidonites.
Is that what they're called? Okay.
Yes, but that's another little city, Sidon. You know, Sidonites know how to cut down trees. That's what we need. Okay, now what is Hiram's reaction? So I am going to build the Lord a house. I need timber. You got timber. What is Hiram's reaction?
He was pleased.
Go do it.
He is pleased. Why is this his reaction?
He gave praise to the Lord for he has given David a wise son to rule
Okay.
the nation.
So, puts it in a theological context because that's what the writer does. Politically, this makes a lot of sense because that means Solomon.
Alliance.
What's that?
He formed an alliance.
They formed an alliance. He's got something that Solomon wants. And what's the deal? So Hiram agrees he's going to provide him with the lumber. And what is Solomon going to give Hiram?
Food.
Is going to give Hiram food, which makes sense because Hiram is king of Tyre, and Tyre is a city, you know, so food is pretty important for a city. I mean, you don't have huge amounts of land to farm. So that's going to be the exchange. And what is the relationship between the two of them?
Peaceful.
They have a peaceful. Okay. Now, so they've made this arrangement. How does King Solomon get his lumber?
I don't know.
Well, he kind of ships it. Before he's shipping it, what does it say he does?
It says he's conscripted.
He constricts labor. Now, how do you go about doing that?
Go grab something.
You go and grab somebody. That's exactly right. And say, you are now working for the king. lucky, this is your lucky day.
Yeah.
You now have a job. Yeah, okay. And how many people are doing this?
30,000.
30,000 men. So he is conscribing a lot of people, right? Volunteers?
No.
No,
No.
forced labor.
That's right, forced labor,
Yep.
which is what kings
Do.
do. This is what kings do even when they're building a temple, right? And who else works on this huge project?
Carriers and stone cutters.
You got stone cutters, and it's interesting, how do they get the lumber to Israel?
Floated it on the sea.
They float it. They
They make rafts.
make
Yeah.
rafts and float it down to Israel. So Solomon is ready to do what? What is Solomon prepared
To
to
build the
do?
temple.
To build a temple. Okay? Now, at this point, how would you describe Solomon's reign? How would you describe his kingship?
Very successful.
Okay, very successful, as defined by, what are signs that he's successful?
The size of his territory and how he organized the people under him.
Organized, it's large,
And he showed his wisdom by the decisions he made, judging people,
he's
issues.
showing wisdom in the way he judges people. What else?
Fairness.
He's fair, what
I'm sure
else?
everybody gets to eat. I mean, they're all being able to feast, have
Yeah,
food.
they're prosperous, the country is prosperous, the country is secure, right?
Yep.
What spiritually, in terms of religion, spirituality, relationship with God, how is
I
Israel?
think it's good because Solomon talks to God.
Okay, good. Solomon is talking to God, right?
And up to this point, God is pleased with him.
And we haven't seen anything that God is displeased with him. Seems to be blessing him, right?
Yep.
And in fact, what is Solomon seeking to do?
What is Solomon thinks seeking to
Put
do?
an ark.
Yeah.
An ark in the temple.
Yeah, he's building God a house. He's going to build God a house. Now, this is going to be interesting. We'll talk a little bit more about it next week. This represents a theological shift too. Because in the past, God dwelt, where did God dwell?
It was always in a tent.
He was in
Yeah.
a tent. The idea is God dwells above the ark. That's sort of his footstool.
Yeah.
But he's in a tent. And why is it a tent?
So he can move with the
Because he
people.
moves around. God is moving around. When you build a temple, where does God dwell?
In the
In the
temple.
temple.
In the temple. He dwells in the temple. And so what is he not doing anymore?
Carrying it in a tent.
He's not moving around.
Yeah.
He is there. And that's really that becomes a theological shift in ancient Judaism. And it's something that we're going to see continue throughout the story in Kings. In fact, in Ezekiel, and Ezekiel's an interesting prophet because he isn't in the land. He's one of the exiles. So he's away, an early exile, where Judah's still a functioning country. You still have a Davidic king, but there were waves of transfers because the land was conquered and people shipped out. And Ezekiel was away from Jerusalem, part of his vision. And Ezekiel's a visionary. He sees visions. One of the things he's going to see is the presence of God, the kavod, the glory of God, leave the temple, because the idea is that that's where God dwells, in that building. That's really different than what we've seen before, but it's still not an omnipresent God, a God that's present everywhere. The idea is God is there, is centralized in this temple, and that's a little shift for the Jews. But it's something that they're going to claim and adopt and follow. So we've got a good guy as king, right? An example to follow. Will that continue?
I doubt it.
And we don't know. Well, we don't know, but they know. The reader here knows it will not continue, of course. But it will continue for a while. We'll look at the temple. We'll look at the temple next week. So we'll look at chapter 6 through 8. 6 through 8. And there's going to be a lot of detail. There's going to be a lot of detail about the temple. But if it's not enough detail, read Chronicles. Read First Chronicles, and there'll be more detail about the temple. So much that you just want to say, stop. I don't care anymore.
So are we to anticipate that history will repeat itself as it has shown in the past? With Solomon fall, like his father David, and back and back and back?
That's an assumption I think we can make. And the writer knows that, because he writes in patterns. All of them are going to have some flaw. And why he does that, who knows? But it would seem to make sense if the focus is on God. You don't want to focus too much on human beings. The human beings in the story are always going to be flawed in some way. So we don't deify humans. Instead, we look to the God who stands above them. And humans are always going to pay the consequences of their actions. And Solomon is going to pay a consequence. There's going to be consequences to Solomon's actions later.
I have a stupid question.
Yes.
Well, back on 4, it talks about, lists all the people that are, Solomon, the 12 district governors. Ben-Hur is one. Now, is Ben-Hur, there was a movie made.
Yes.
Okay, was there really a big race like that?
Well, was there?
In a chariot.
Oh. Were there chariot races in ancient Rome?
Yeah, it was Ben-Hur.
Not here. No, wouldn't have been here.
Oh.
Ben means son. In
so
Hebrew.
it isn't like the Ben-Hur that was in the chariot
Right.
race.
Ben means son. That's.
Told you it was a stupid question.
No. Well, Ben doesn't mean son. Ben means son in Hebrew. So whenever you see Ben, that's why Jesus' name would have been like Joshua ben Joseph, because Ben, that's how you identify people, by that kind of lineage. So yeah, that would just mean son of her. Oh, and I checked on Ray, and that's the only reference in the entire Bible. So it doesn't refer to anybody before, which I think is interesting, but it doesn't. His name just doesn't appear. So, any other questions?
If we fast forward from today's story that we talked about to today's time.
Right.
We talked about Israel and Judah. didn't we?
Yeah.
So the Israel that we actually recognize today as a country,
Yeah.
how does what we've talked about today in the story of Judah and the 10 tribes of Israel, where do those two dovetail into the Israel that we talk about today, whenever we all get excited and think we are supporting God's people of Israel?
Right. And I'm going to give a little opinion, but it's not just random. It's, I think, based on scripture, but I don't want it to sound like this is the way. So it's my interpretation. When Israel, the modern state of Israel, was formed in 48, 47, 48, I think 48, in their constitution, they don't claim to be the spiritual antecedent of ancient Israel in their constitution, because they view themselves as a secular state. And they even did that intentionally. You don't call citizens of Israel Israelites. You call them Israelis. And that was an intentional decision, that they wouldn't carry the name that was associated with ancient Israel. Because the Constitution says the two states are different. This isn't a spiritual state. This is a secular state. Although they claim the Star of David, which is interesting, not any symbol from Solomon, but from kind of a connection to the Davidic. But it wasn't a kingship. Now, if you wanted to make that connection, I don't think you're on real solid ground. There's so many differences between even the way the secular state is set up and ancient Israel, the state of Israel. Difference between monarchy, parliamentary democracy, claiming to be a secular state, not a spiritual state. There's a lot of differences. A multicultural state, that's what the Constitution says. So I'm not sure that's a real strong, I don't think that's the strongest argument on biblical grounds. And I've said that to some people. Be real careful when you do that, because at one time the Jews were looking at other places to settle, to make their land. And I'm talking about in the 1920s and 30s when Zionism becomes stronger. And they looked at land that wasn't in the Middle East as a possible homeland. Madagascar off the coast of Africa was considered. And internationally, how do we deal with Jews in Europe? We're going to give them a homeland away from Europe. And Madagascar was considered one of the oblasts in Russia, way towards Mongolia, was set aside. It still is set aside as a Jewish oblast, and that's like a little territory, little state, that's supposed to be dedicated to the Jews. This is where Russian Jews were supposed to be. That would be their homeland, way towards Mongolia. So even the Jews saw different places that would be their spiritual homeland, not necessarily in the Middle East, in this part of Palestine. So it's shaky. That's a real shaky argument. I'm not even sure the Jewish leaders now would view themselves as the spiritual state of Israel. Add to it the fact that Israel becomes, after the split with Judah, doesn't become the spiritual state. Israel becomes, no better than other ancient areas, and they become adversaries of Judah. Judah and Israel will fight wars against each other, and Judah is going to be the spiritual state. So, you can do it, but I think the grounds are pretty tenuous, historically and biblically. I think you're on that's slippery. Slippery slope. It's like being on sand. If you're going to build it, the foundation is going to be pretty weak, biblically and historically. I don't think that's a great. I think you can ground it on something better than that. But I see that constantly. I see that all the time. That Israel, the modern state of Israel, is, God's state. And okay,
Jerusalem is still there.
Jerusalem is still there. Right. It's whether the secular state of Israel is somehow special in God's sight. When it was founded, they didn't see it as special, as a special spiritual state. And whether now it is, maybe, that becomes sort of a faith thing. I don't think, and that's why I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just saying it's hard to get there. That's not an easy thing the step to make biblically. That's kind of tricky. You've almost got to decide that that's what you want to do, and so I'm going to make that step. It would be hard to get there, other than the name being the same. That would be the only thing that would tie it together.
And the our people are coming in, they want the land Israel, or claiming it as theirs, and they're fighting over it?
Well, I remember years and years ago, there was a political cartoon by a guy named David Horsey. And he did for the Seattle, a newspaper in Seattle. Really good cartoonist. And I remember it well. And in the cartoon were little frames, and it had the land of Israel written above it. And in the little cartoons, it had different people kicking out other people. And so you had the Israel kicking out the Canaanites, and then the Babylonians kicking out the Israelites, and then the Persians kicking out the Babylonians, and then the Greeks kicking out the Persians, and then the Romans kicking out the Greeks, and then the Arabs kicking out, the Romans, and then you had the Turks kicking out the Arabs, and then you had the British kicking out the Turks. And then down below it says, well, whose land is it anyway? I think that's really tricky because it's belonged to a lot of different people. And in fact, I was having a little correspondence with the person who said, well, the ancient stuff goes back to, okay, but they're ancient sites that predate Israel. Well, is it their land then?
Yeah.
It just gets really, really gummy if we say the state of Israel does not claim that this is land because God gave them the land. That's not in their constitution. So if they don't claim it, should we? Well, maybe. But, it gets just really, really tricky when you start doing it. I think it does. I'd rather take that part of the argument out. Then we can deal with other things. And I think Israel has the right, as any nation, to exist as a nation. They're just, they're in a place.
And you've been there for how long?
Well,
Israel's been Israel for...
Well, they've been there since 48. They hadn't been there for about, 1,000 years before that. So, it just gets really tricky. It gets really sticky.
You're saying 1948?
1948, yeah.
So that's when the country of Israel, what had it been prior to that?
Before 1948, it was between 1948 to 1919.
What are you doing?
It was the British Protectorate of Palestine. The British, before 1919, it was part of the Ottoman Empire. And that would go back to the 16th century. So it was part of the Ottoman Empire for 300, 400 years. And then before that...
That's where the Palestinian name...
Well, these were Ottoman Turks. So they're not... The Palestinians are Arab. And that goes back, before the Turks conquered it, it goes back to, when it was the Arab conquest in the 7th century, that just takes over the Middle East, the Muslim conquest of the Middle East. That's when it became Arab. And that goes back to, 7th century, 8th century. Before then, it was part of the Byzantine Empire. So it was Greek. It was ruled by the Greek Romans. So, wow. And it was Christian. That's right. That's why the Crusades, when the Crusaders conquered the Holy Land, in what they considered certainly the Holy Land, in the 11th century, during the First Crusade, one of the things they did, because they were conquering it in the name of Jesus Christ, they put Jews, not only did they, that's where indulgences started. Popes gave knights the right to kill as many people as they could and not pay consequence because they were conquering the Holy Land. They burned Jews in the synagogue, locked Jews in their synagogue and burned them because they're not Christian either. So this was supposed to be Christian land. And they had a kingdom of Jerusalem, called the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And then they had a Christian king that was there for about 150 years before the Arab Muslims conquered it again. And so this area's had a real dynamic history. And part of the reason it was so incredibly important is it's between two huge river civilizations. between Mesopotamia and Egypt. It's there, the Fertile Crescent. It's right there, so it becomes really an important route for any kind of trading between these two huge, powerful cultures. So it's always been, but it's also changed hands because you had two huge cultures. One would tend to influence that area more than the other. This is kind of a blip when both Egypt and Mesopotamia are weak. That enables this to occur, historically. So this becomes an interesting time. I like this stuff.
Yeah.
I guess we can't appreciate that when we're in a country that's young compared to a lot of these countries.
Yeah.
We don't have the history.
That's exactly right. And like I said, this area just was conquered over and over and over again because it's in that central trade route. The conquerors were either coming from the south or coming from the east. And then later, we're coming from the Far East through the Mediterranean. So this was an area that was conquered by a lot of people. And when they conquered, settled. I mean, this was prime Christian land. If you, in the year 400, this would have been one of the centers of Christianity when the Byzantines ruled it, before Islam was even a religion. So it's been conquered, held by a lot of people. And that's why how do you work it out becomes really complicated. Whose land is it anyway? I don't know. Depends on.
I don't like complicated.
It is. It is. It is incredibly complicated. It would be similar for us if all of a sudden we had Iroquois show up and say, "Oh, by the way, this was our land, and so we'd like you to leave."
Yeah.
And we said, no, we've been here 300 years, and they say, well, we were here. We've been around here 1,000 years. So hit the bricks.
Get going.
All right, let's have a word of prayer. Lord God, thank you so much for guiding us through this. Help us to focus on your continued involvement in this story. You're the one that's driving it. Help us claim Solomon as a positive example until he's not. But help us also remember that this is your story, not his. In the name of Christ we pray, amen.
Amen.